Thanks all of you for joining us. You're really in for a treat. Bill Clegg is one of my favorite writers. He's written 2 best-selling memoirs, Diary of a Drug Addict as a Young Man and 90 Days. His debut novel, which I think Bill did one of his earliest events with us, was Did You Ever Have a Family? Hit the bestseller list immediately. It was long-listed for both the Man Booker and the National Book Awards. He's also written for tons of magazines, including The New Yorker. And he does all of this. And in addition, his day job is that he he's a literary agent with an agency, shockingly, called the Clegg Agency. And he now joins us for a second novel, The End of the Day, which is now out in paperback. We'll talk about what it was like to have a hardcover come out during the pandemic. And this book has been described as having incredible scope and unforgettable characters. Both things are true. So I am delighted, Bill, to welcome you to RJ Julia, Wesleyan RJ Julia, and BookHampton.
Thanks, Roxanne. I remember that event, which was in 2015, and it was one of the first for Did You Ever Have a Family? And I remember walking in, it looks like this sort of quiet little Connecticut bookstore. And I walked in, there must have been like 200 people in that place.
Yeah, there were a lot. We were sold out.
But like, it was so clear, like they didn't know who I was, but like, they did everything you told them to. Like, you're like, buy this book. They're like, okay. But it was such a fun night. I had such a ball that night.
It was great. And you know, RJ Julia is actually all over. You've developed a big fan base. So when the new book came out, we had lots of people interested right away. So, you know, Bill, I want to start with this, which maybe is going to be a weird question. And if it is, say, Rox, that's a weird question. Let's go on to question 2. But, you know, we read, I believe, to learn how to live our lives. And research has shown that reading fiction causes you to develop empathy. And your capacity to create characters that are revealed to be quite different than what they seem not only shows an understanding of humanity, but it also shows a kindness towards an array of folks from all different walks of life and positions. And it made me think about, like, did you become that observant, or were you wired that way? You know, like sometimes you see people that are just wired that way, but it seems to come so naturally in both your fiction books and even in conversation. So where did you get that ability, young man?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You know, I think a lot of it has to do, I'm very grateful I didn't grow up with the internet, is one thing, in the sense that, you know, I grew up in a small Connecticut town, you know, at the end of a long driveway. You know, there was like, we didn't, you know, we had public television barely on TV, but we didn't have normal TV. We didn't, there were no cell phones. And it was just a tiny town, and it was very limited. And so I think, but, you know, it was 2 hours north of New York. And so you would have these families coming up on the weekends and in the summers. And that was really those were the first glimpses of the world outside of this small town that I had, were, you know, these families that would come in, and I just was so curious, you know, I mean, honestly, like, it was just so mysterious that they lived in a place like New York City. And so I think I just was very curious. And then when I found books, you know, when I was young, I read everything I could get my hands on. And I had a really good friend who's still a really good friend. And I remember in 3rd grade, she just started feeding me everything she was reading, and she was incredibly precocious and reading things way ahead of a third grade level. So oftentimes I didn't really understand what I was reading, but I wanted to kind of keep up with her. But we read everything. We read everything from like Danielle Steele to, you know,
grade?
Dickens. What's that?
In third grade?
You know, in like third, fourth grade, like we were just, yeah. I mean, again, there wasn't much else going on. Like, I mean, you know, we were in the woods until sundown, and then we were in the house without TV. So, you know, in a way, that was, for me anyway, like I'm sure there were lots of other things that people did, but I just disappeared into books. And so it was sort of my way of finding out about the world. But I always kind of felt like once I was in the world, that I was kind of getting it wrong, because I would see someone and sort of all the possibilities would emerge. And sort of over the course of my adult life, I feel like my education has been unlearning all of my like preconceived notions about people. That sort of peeling of the onion of like, you see someone and, you know, my instinct was always, often, especially in New York, just like, you know, they've had it easy, or like, you know, they're happy, or like they're living an uncomplicated life. And especially when I went into recovery, when I got sober, suddenly I was in these rooms with, you know, sort of everyone from every walk of life, and rich, famous, homeless, you know, really
no one was immune.
No one was immune. And like, regardless of how extremely different their lives were, oftentimes the description of the feelings of certain circumstances were very similar. So like, I think for me, the project of becoming an adult in some ways, which happened a little bit late for me, was sort of understanding how common like the human experience is, how like there are huge differences and huge prejudices and huge limitations for lots of people, but actually I think that there's more that we have in common than different. And so I still get struck by somebody like naming a feeling or naming an experience in language that feels very similar to mine, even though that person may be like a 17-year-old kid who's in recovery, who's describing something that me at 50 years old like it feels as if they're speaking what I'm thinking. And so that's a sort of surprise I always like sort of arriving at. And so I think, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's sort of the experience of how I interact with people, which is that it's.
So it makes me think about three other questions. And one sort of a question comment, but you know, I have a friend who talks about whenever you are going to compare your inside self to somebody's outside self, you will fail by comparison.
Right.
And juxtaposing that with something that Sherry Turkle talks about, who's a writer that does a lot of work at the intersection of tech and social behavior. And what she talks about that is becoming increasingly dangerous, which goes, Bill, to your comment about when you were growing up, is that we ourselves are separating our inside and outside self. That when we go on social media and think about teenagers going on first thing in the morning, they're not Bill Clegg, the person in doubt and worrying, challenged and thinking about doing everything. They're Bill Clegg, capital B, capital C, because that's what you've got to put on social media, so that your own disparity inside yourself gets worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, I can see that with the young people I know, like how they experience social media, how they interact with it, and friends, and even myself. Like, you go on social media, and I mean, if anybody goes on my social media, all they're going to see are like donuts and slices of pizza. So I don't think I've ever posted a picture of myself, except one maybe when I was like 23. Like that's up there.
Yeah.
but yeah, no, but it's interesting because you're right. Like it is a window. I mean, I remember driving by the houses in the town that I grew up, that the ones that I was, kind of longed for in a way, and all you could see was sort of the lit windows, and you sort of slow down and look through and
make up a story.
And you make up a story, and you absolutely make up a story, and it's so the opposite of, the truth is, if you ever do, there's been a few times in my life in New York where some of those stories I actually got to see from the inside out years later. And it's just like, I want to go back in time in some ways and just like sit my little 13-year-old self down and just say, listen, kid, like, it's like, but then again, like also that imagining, that projection, like, is creative in its own way. And so it's, so maybe I don't actually want to sit him down in some ways, because I wouldn't want to, neutralize that process.
Yeah. So let's go to the characters in the book, because I think it will allow us to expand on part of this conversation. So for anybody who hasn't read the book, and I'm shameless in insisting that people read Bill's books, but if in case you haven't read it, there are secrets in the book and surprises, and Bill and I will do our best to not reveal any of those. But we have, at the beginning of the book, you essentially start at the end of the story in many ways. And then you introduce us to all the characters and their journey. But most of them do not know the secret that we know. The reader knows it, and one of the character knows it. Did that way of revealing their story, where they're uninformed and we're informed, was that deliberate? What did you see as the advantage of doing that?
It was deliberate. It was also part of what interested me in the scenario of these characters. I sort of it's continuing this idea of like, one doesn't really know, what informs what somebody's presenting, like what's really going on with them, or what's gone on with them in the past. It's, like I know in work, like, you suddenly deal with somebody who's incredibly touchy or snappy with you, or maybe that's at a restaurant, and the quick instinct is to, sort of say like, what an asshole, you know what I mean? Or like, they've got a real short temper, like what's wrong with them? They shouldn't be doing what they're doing. And, but the truth is that like, there could be a whole empire of experience that like precedes that moment. Like you could specifically trigger them in some way because of like the shirt you have on, because of, we just have no idea like what leads up to the interactions that people have in life, and what causes them to be the way they are. And it's very hard to remember that in the thick of an interaction that's unpleasant or not going the way you want it to. But this idea that the characters in the book share they share this past, but it wasn't the same past. They didn't experience it the same, and they have very strong ideas about what happened, and so and have made decisions and actions based on perceptions of what they thought had happened. It's kind of an exaggerated version, I think, of sort of like what goes on in real life, in the way that we step away from people oftentimes because like we presumed something, or something was said, and so but we don't really know what happened. In this case, it's these two childhood friends who were kind of inseparable, and then for almost half a century didn't speak to each other, until one of them turns up in the driveway of the other. and so like why these two people would be estranged, what would like, you know, lead them to be apart for all that time is kind of what I was unraveling. And again, it was sort of an exaggerated version of what I kind of think goes on. You know, I have friends who haven't spoken to siblings in
Yeah.
like over a decade because of some perceived slight or some perceived, you know, kind of misdeed. And I'm always amazed that like there isn't more investigation sometimes into sort of like what that original sin was that sort of caused the rupture. And then years pass, like years, life gallops pretty quickly, it seems like, after 25. So.
And Bill, you know, it's true in this book, in your book, not this book. We're not talking about somebody else's book. What an idiot I am. But what is it that you think is the obstacles for all of us to go back and try to understand it? Because I've watched it, and it's so corrosive. It's just so corrosive, the way people, and you know, sometimes ourselves, allow those things to happen. Do you think it's fear? Do you think it's about we don't want to know how we were complicit in something? What's your sense of what that's about?
I think you know, I think it's probably very subjective, but I think fear is a big one. And pain. I mean, I think when it comes to like love, which is something that definitely existed between these two women, and I think one of them, you know, probably was a little bit in love with the other.
Yeah, I thought so too. I actually have a question around that when we get to it.
Yeah, and you know, but they grew up in a time where that was not like, you know, there was no evidence of that around them in any way. It wouldn't have been okay. They weren't socialized to think that that kind of romantic love would have been okay. But I think there was real love, and at this, you know, sort of moment of perceived betrayal, like the pain, it was so great that there's a way in which, like, I think as time goes on, one doesn't want to like return to that pain. I think sometimes it's just as simple as that, is like averting pain. And I think in their case, there was, it's all bundled into, there's guilt, there's just like so much, because to go back, you know, whether it's like a parent and a child, or siblings or old friends, like to go back to the original rupture is to sort of like face yourself and to kind of to be accountable for whatever your part was. Those things don't tend to just happen to somebody. They tend to be, you know, co-authored. I mean, you know, I reference this all the time, but like in my recovery, that's one thing about getting sober in a certain way that's really, really tough, but also amazing, is, you know, there are certain programs of recovery that actually insist that you go back to the original rupture and insist that you take accountability for your part.
Did some damage.
What's that?
And you did some damage.
Oh yeah, I mean, I had to go into a lot of bomb sites, you know, in a hazmat suit, being willing to make amends. It's the most terrifying thing, because it's looking in an old mirror. It's looking at a version of yourself that is not maybe one that you want to see. But the use of it is you clean the wound, and you also really connect with the impact that you had on somebody else, and you usually get closer to the truth.
And you know, Bill, because the other thing is in your first book, there was more about forgiveness, and here, since most of the characters don't know who the harm was done by, or if there was harm done, so the perpetrators of the damage have to deal with their own forgiving or absolving themselves of what they did wrong, which seems to me to be harder, because I could be asking you for forgiveness and you might not even credit me with all my bad intentions as fully as I might myself.
Right.
And so I assume that was deliberate here, that no one was forgiving anybody else because they didn't really know what was done.
Yeah, and that's also kind of it. You know, falls under the kind of category in some ways of it. This isn't inherited trauma, but this is trauma that's passed down, in the sense that there are things that happen. There is damage done that nobody sees, except those who it happened to. And so and so I think this is, again, sort of talking about, you know, when we arrive at a certain moment in somebody's life, like we very likely will never know, like, you know, whatever they suffered through before they arrived at that moment where they meet us. But that trauma, that damage that was done by somebody who, like, is never credited for that, but yet that damage is kind of, for a long time, is very likely running the show. And so in the case of this book, it isn't that it isn't. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to discourage anybody from reading, obviously, but sometimes there's, like, forgiveness it may be possible, but a reunion, or a coming together, and that sometimes it's too late. Sometimes there's too much time passed, there's too much damage done,
and you
so
won't be satisfied.
What's that?
And you won't be satisfied.
That's it. I mean, I think there is a kind of a story we tell ourselves, that there's always time to kind of, like, make up for the things that we've done. There's always time to, in all sorts of ways, to pay off that credit card, to make peace with that person, to make right what's wrong. And then at a certain point, like, time runs out. And that was also very much on my mind in the book, is just that I think for a lot of the years that these people live, like, there's a sense of kind of endless time ahead of them to fix or find or figure out, and at a certain point, like, the clock runs out, and you only have, like, the day that you're in.
But there's an irony that I think exists in the book, which fascinated me. And that is, so you have three main characters: Dana, Jackie, and Lupita. And they represent disparities of economics. They represent disparities of agency. Dana is a very wealthy, privileged woman. Jackie represents what maybe when you were growing up was the person, what were called year-round people, which had inferior status to the wealthy people coming in from wherever the wealthy people came from, Boston or New York, in the case of your town, New York. And then you had Lupita, who was part of the service staff that was expected, and in this case, a family that emigrated from Mexico. So clearly the power, or the natural power, was in the hands of Dana, right? She had the money, she had the influence, she had the standing, she was the it girl, lived in the big, gorgeous house that you were, peeking at and making up stories about. But in fact, I came away feeling like Dana had the least control over her life. Like, she ironically had the least agency ultimately. Is that make any sense? Did you think about it that way?
Yes, I think she had the least amount of agency over the things that mattered to her the most. And at that time, when young, that was Jackie in many ways. She couldn't legislate that. She couldn't control it. Like she couldn't control what Jackie would do. And so, you know, it's the two of them were so different in so many ways because Dana almost has like unlimited choices. Jackie understands very pragmatically, very early that she has much more limited choices. And so she sets in motion a series of events that will secure a future for her that she feels is the kind of the best version of what she can navigate, given, you know, sort of like what her economic, you know, kind of limitations are. And so Jackie sort of sets about to, you know, she sets her sights on someone, she secures that she does what she needs to do. And Dana has sort of an empire of choices ahead of her. And yet the one thing that she wants is somehow just to be kind of aligned with Jackie. And but Jackie sort of like left the building, as it were, and there's nothing she can do about it. And I think also the other thing is she didn't have control over her parents. And I think like very early on, she understood that like her mother like was, you never knew you're going to get. She might be on pills, she might be not, like, and so I think the father's very absent. And so I have you know, I think she's somebody who, you know, from a distance looked like she had a lot of agency, but I think had very little control over the things that mattered to her the most.
You know, and it strikes me that there are two things as I was listening to you that converge. One is sort of the paradox of choice, right? If you have too many choices, you almost become immobilized because it's too many options. You know, I think there have been studies done about this, like give somebody two options and they actually feel better than if they have endless options. But the other thing that I don't think I thought about quite as clearly as I'm listening to you is that there's this sort of this perverse advantage to being practical about what your options are. Now, in some ways, like Jackie, I wanted to kill her because she could have done so. It seemed she had the opportunity to go to school. But she picked a choice, and I thought, well, Rox, that's your judgment that would be better. Maybe not.
But Jackie's interesting because Jackie, I think, talks herself out of having that kind of agency. I think she doesn't presume it, and yet in life, she shows up. Like she's actually like her, you know, her husband, you know, sort of works higgledy-piggledy here and there. Like, do you know what I mean? But she's the one who sort of like gets a job as a secretary at the elementary school. She ends up raising those kids. She ends up sort of taking care. She ends up being, you know, the breadwinner, the parent. And so over her universe, she has an enormous amount of control, which is the sort of the thing that she's beginning to lose, like, you know, as we meet her at the beginning of the book.
Right.
And so, so like control is an agency are both things that are kind of central to the book in all sorts of ways: money, economics, ethnicity, and all the doors that are open and closed to people. Also age, like, so like at her age, she's, you know, wildly capable as a person. Like she's been able to do it, you know, kind of everything. And then, but her faculties are just beginning to diminish a bit. And her daughter is like moving in to take over control, and she's not happy about it.
Yeah. You know, we could, I want to get to some other questions that are unrelated to the plot of the book. But one of the things that I was struck by, Bill, so I read the book whenever I would have gotten the galley. So I think I read that book. I think I read the book almost a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And then I read it again because I was going to interview you. My memory's not so great that I was clear on all of it, but
I had to look at it today myself. It's been a year since it came out. I finished it like 2 years ago. So I have to freshen up too.
But Bill, here's the thing that I loved about it. You know, there's a line by Calvino about in his book called Why Read the Classics, that and his line is that a classic resides in the unconscious memory of your mind. And I was reminded when I reread the book over the weekend, how so much of your book stuck in my head over the last year and a half. And I think one that particularly struck me is the idea that people who have privilege, and I almost hate that word at this point, but I'm going to go with it in the case of Dana, don't even appreciate the degree to which they use that indiscriminately over other people's lives. You were pressing it, Bill, but I realized how much that notion from your book concretized what we've been listening to and learning about over the past year, because that's what Dana did, right? She just was like, well, I know better, and I know better how to fix your life and your life and your life, and I'll just take care of it.
Yeah.
And you know, I think you'll be better off, but who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. In the moment, she has like a, you know, just an instinct of what she needs in the moment, something that she needs, and without any sense of what the implications for anyone else might be. And she moves certain people like, you know, like a piece on a chessboard.
Yeah.
But that's also how even, you know, like employment can be like that. When somebody's desperate to be employed, look at that family. Lupita's family splits in half in order to be employed, in order to get, you know, green cards, in order to, like, someday even maybe to get citizenship. And they agree to this scenario where in which they quite literally split in half, which is unthinkable. I mean, but out of necessity they do it. And so yeah, and getting back to what I said earlier, as common as so much of our experiences are in terms of fear and hope and love and, you know, desire and stuff like that, the lived experience in this country, like, it's the range of it is so unbelievably great, you know, from the 1% to, you know, people who are in detention centers on the border right now. And so it's so this country really embodies like the extremity of it.
You know, I loved Lupita. I loved the life she put together. I loved the way there was just something that felt so deliberate and powerful to me about her. I mean, talk about taking agency over yourself. I mean, that was really striking, but I won't go down this path any more than the statement, but I think about, my parents are both immigrants. And I think about how different my parents came in on boats, on piers, on, you know, on the west side. Ellis Island was closed. They came in the late 40s after World War II. And, you know, B'nai B'rith or Hadassah or somebody was there, gave my father $5. He didn't speak English. They figured out he was a baker. He was Hungarian. He had a job within 24 hours. They got him to a union office for bakers, and they had an apartment for him and his friends from the boat. The plumber, the electrician, and the baker all had apartments that we would kill for on York and 88th. But, you know, think about that. Not that there weren't complications about immigration in those days, but think about, there's a 19-year-old orphaned I guess you're orphaned at 19, getting off the boat and then being shepherded to get help in the United States.
Yeah,
Crazy.
that's the best version of the experience, I would guess. But I'd like to think, like, even in this story, they're certainly not at the juncture of arrival, but for Lupita, and I think I've experienced this in my own life. I've watched it in others, and I've heard a million stories about how there are good people, and there are junctures of kindness, whether they be grand as the one that you just described, an apartment, a job, like basically a life like delivered. And that's the moment with Alice and Lupita, and
Right.
like where and it is just sort of a reminder. It's just like, those kinds of generosities and kindnesses, and like we all have the responsibility to be able to extend that.
And it's part of, I think about it, it's also our jobs, that there are small kindnesses, there are big kindnesses, but we should, I know this sounds kind of preachy and dopey, but we shouldn't forget that I learned that from my dad, that just saying hello the right way to the person who's the, bagger in the supermarket, or cleaning your room in a hotel, to talk to them about, say, how's your day going, or what time did you start work, or how long is your commute?
Yeah.
Is a very different experience than ignoring them, or just making them invisible, not paying attention.
Yeah.
All right, but we're not going to get with, I shouldn't have gone down that path. Sorry. But here's what I'd love to talk about, talking about love. I adored the article you wrote in Vogue. Would you share with all of us how you inadvertently became a father?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I have a 6-year-old niece, and 5 years ago, she was being taken by the state of Connecticut into foster care, and because her father, my brother, and mother, my brother's ex-girlfriend, were not at a place where they could take care of her, and we found out about it quite by accident, quite by the miracle of growing up in a small town. Actually, they lived above a liquor store, and the owner of the liquor store had directed the caseworker up to their apartment, and instantly knew something was going on, and called my oldest friend, actually the very same friend who gave me books when I was in 3rd grade.
I was wondering if that was Lisa who gave
It's Lisa. Yeah. She appears like in the memoir. She's all over the place in my life, like always sort of.
I know her.
She's like affecting some magic at every turn. And she called me as I was heading out to lunch, and she was just like, something's going on. They've come to take Ivy. And so very swiftly we sort of maneuvered she actually got appointed to be the emergency guardian. And then we were then appointed temporary guardians. And we didn't know that it was going to be for longer than, a little while. Although there was the sort of under rumble of maybe it would be for longer than that. And now 5 years later, she's 6.5 years old, and we haven't killed her yet. And but when I meet 2-year-olds now, I'm just like, wait, was she that old when she came to us? I mean, we had no idea what to do, none. Yeah. And 2, like, I think it was great that we didn't have a minute to think about it, because I think if we thought about it, we would have just like collapsed. But she's great, and we're finishing an adoption process right now, and she's our daughter effectively. I still call her my niece. She still calls us
Uncle Bill, right?
Uncle Bill and Uncle Van. Yeah. My uncles. Like, so when she's like telling a babysitter or a nanny who's coming into the house, she's like, my uncles don't like it when, and she's like, she sort of walks around and points, and that's where my uncle works. And like, so, but yeah. and she'll always use I think she takes comfort in those terms. So we'll never be anything but uncles. And that's exactly as it should be.
Bill, do you think absent that accident, coincidence, you would have become a parent?
I didn't really we had talked about it at some point earlier on in our marriage. And then we sort of had a rough patch in our marriage, and that took a little while to kind of figure out. And then on the other side of it, like, I was looking down the barrel of 50, and I'm 50 now, and I just thought, like, I don't want to be. My dad was an old dad, like, and I didn't really. Yeah, I don't. My husband would have a different answer. I think he was pretty intent on having kids, but I was kind of equally intent on not. And so, so this sort of took the decision out of our hands.
Yeah, which sort of goes to your book about, right, your brother's action or inaction ended up controlling in a wonderful way.
It's shaped our lives. It's completely reordered our lives. And you're right, exactly. That, like, it's not always the person right next to you or even down the hall. It's like, it's somebody in another state that may do something that could upend your life. But a friend of mine has this quote, which a long time ago, when I was sort of in the middle of my own catastrophe, she came to the hospital and she wrote this down on a piece of paper, and it's taped to my computer screen in New York. And it's a quote. I don't know where she got it from, but it says, most of us are too busy trying to be happy to recognize that it is catastrophe that reorders our lives in the most wondrous ways. And I have it taped, and it's borne out. It's definitely borne out. So
yeah. Bill, my last question before I ask a question from one of somebody in our audience is, so you've written 2 fiction books now, 2 memoirs.
Yeah.
You were a literary agent pre your recovery. You're a literary agent now. How has becoming a writer made you a different type of literary agent? Does it make you more judgmental, less judgmental, change what interests you?
Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure it changes what I'm interested in terms of what I read and what I choose to represent, but I definitely think it has changed the way I interact with authors, particularly around the occasion of being published. I think until you go through it, there's just really no way to describe it. It's when you're with something for so long and alone, and it's in your head, even while you're not working on it, it's in your head, and then suddenly it's shaped into an object that's in the world, and then it gets judged, and it's just, there's a certain level of
nervous. It must be, I mean, maybe not with your second book, but with your first book, must have been nerve-wracking to think, well, they're going to say, how the hell could he do such a horrible job on a book, the big deal literary agent?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, it's weird. And it's one thing I've always told writers is, like, unless you feel like you have to write it, don't bother. Like, because it's mortifying. It's like, it's a mortifying, even in the best circumstance, and I know it a lot also from my own experience, but from the experience of writers who I represent. And I'm very lucky I represent, I think, some of the best writers in the English language right now. And I've watched them win awards and have spectacular success. And the experience of that, like, whether it's at the pinnacle of success or like the depths of being, sort of ignored, it's not what you think it is. And so it's a vulnerable thing. It's a vulnerable thing. And it's also an amazing thing. I don't want to make it sound like a terrible thing, but it's, but I think going through that process, which is a lot of my job, is working 12 months in advance of a book publishing, talking about, the jacket, the copy, like, how we're talking about it, and so I feel them. I know something of what they go through, and I think that helps me with my job. And there's certain things that matter to them that I'll go to the mat for, because I know what that experience of feeling exposed is like. So yeah, but I think it's actually, I think it's also made me a better agent, in the sense that before I wrote, I think I suffered the slings and arrows that were pointed at my clients, like as if they were at me. I took them very personally. If somebody reviewed one of my writers unfairly, it killed me. But also their successes, I think I felt too much. And so now it's all kind of evened out. Like, I have my own thing. I sort of work on it, sort of in private. And I think I'm just, wounded enough when they get attacked, but I'm not dead on the floor, and I'm not like running around like an injustice collector every time they get a bad review like I used to be. So,
I mean, for one, you were very clever to publish a hardcover fiction book in the midst of a pandemic.
pretty good idea, huh?
That was really good, Bill. Very, very clever timing. But, it seems to me, from what I read and from what I know goes on in the bookstores, is publishing seems very changed, whether it's temporary or permanent. But it seems to me, I think I read a statistic that something like 90 something percent of the books that were published in the last 12 months sold under 5,000 copies. That it's gotten deeper in terms of what's selling. I mean, book sales were up during the pandemic, but it was deeper, not wider. Are you seeing that in trying to sell in books?
Oh yeah, like it. I mean, I think when something's working, it's really working. Like, and it's working in big numbers, and then. And I think, the situation of the pandemic, the situation of the election, the situation of Black Lives Matter, all that erupted over the summer, and the empire of history that precedes it, those books that spoke directly to what was going on in the country did extremely well. From Mary Trump to the James Baldwin backlist. And that's phenomenal. That's great, especially the backlist stuff. But and that was really cool. There was a lot of there were books that maybe had been successful and even important once upon a time, but were suddenly very useful, in our sort of American crisis. And so watching those books do really well, was exciting. I think for fiction, for literature that's happening right now, it's difficult. It's difficult to pierce the culture with a news cycle that exists the way it does. And so I think if you're not speaking immediately to what's happening in the country, I think or if you don't already have a pre-existing massive fan base like Stephen King or something like that, I think those predictable pleasures, still Danielle Steele, she's still on the bestseller list right now, which is amazing. And Stephen, I think it's either predictable pleasures or things that are helping you understand what the country's going through, what we're going through. Those are the things that are selling really big. And then other books, make their way. But this is the other thing, which is this country may be in a situation 10 years from now where one of those books that got ignored now may be the thing that we need. And so I think that's the thing about literature, especially, is that if you're, it's great if a book is a bestseller. It's great if it gets great reviews and gets awards, but it can't be the reason you're writing a book. If that's the kind of book you're writing. And so we have no idea when it's going to be needed. Just like we have no idea when we're going to be needed. So I think you sort of put it out there and stand by it, and then and move on to something else. But
you never know. One of the things that is obviously the job of an independent bookseller, and I see this from peers that I talk to all the time, our job is to make sure that our customers are exposed to a broader range of books. I don't need to tell them about Stephen King's book. I carry it. I admire him. I think he's a phenomenally gifted writer, but I don't need to put that book in their hand. I need, our job, all our booksellers, what they're brilliant at is reading a range of books, and you come in and we know you can judge a book by a cover, but not a person. And, they come in, we want to understand what it is they might be in the mood for, which would be different today than yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a small, unpaid political announcement to support independent bookstores.
Indeed. Thank God for you guys.
So I have a question from the audience that'll be our last question. Hi, Bill. I love your book. Did you ever have a family? Well, wait till they read this one. Do you think Rick was the most important character and or chapter? I feel like his chapter was the most insightful on certain characters such as Luke, which is probably leaving a lot of people in the dust here, because if they did read it, they might not even remember those names. But in order to be kind to this audience person, if you would be good enough to answer that question.
What, I missed the chapter. Like what?
I feel like his chapter, Rick's chapter.
Oh, Rick. Well, that's interesting. I mean, it's certainly, it's important to me. I think it's important to the book. It sets up a lot, but Rick is the son of Jackie, who is one of the three central characters in The End of the Day, and he has a moment in the beginning of the book where he's sitting in the driveway of Jackie's house, and after the house has blown up and burned down, and his friend has died, and this wedding hasn't happened, and she comes out and consoles him. And so when I was writing Did You Ever Have a Family, that character of this sort of woman in her late 60s who was widowed, and she makes an appearance, and that's all you see of her in Did You Ever Have a Family. But
So you resurrected her.
What's that?
So you resurrected her.
I just was so interested in her. Like, I don't know. I just was sort of curious about who this person was in a house coat who left her porch light on in the middle of the day. And then I just started writing I just kept on writing her. And I thought that she might be further in Did You Ever Have a Family? And then it became clear that she was part of something else that was more complicated. And that's what this second novel became.
Yeah. So Bill, our hour is up. We're 1 minute over. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. B, for those of you who haven't bought the book, I urge you to buy it ASAP. Make sure you have some time to do nothing else but read a book, because that's what you're going to want to do. And Bill, when will we see your next book?
Not for a little while. I'm just towing in right now and wallowing a bit. But it'll be I think it's the last book that I'll write that's in that fictional town of Wells.
Well, I can't wait. And Bill, maybe now we can even get to have lunch in New York. Like,
I'd love it.
Like real people who have meals together outside in New York.
Imagine that.
Back.
Well, I'll be there from the end of August on. So anytime you're in town, let me know.
All right.
Thanks, Roxanne. It was good to see you.
Yeah, it was great to see you and have the conversation, and congratulations on this book. It was just great. Thanks to all of you signed up. Thanks for supporting RJ Julia, and have a great rest of the evening.